I met Gail at an inter-college festival when we were both in our early 20s, and honestly, it was like something out of a movie. He was this sweet, earnest guy who seemed completely smitten with me from the moment we started talking. I remember thinking how refreshing it was to meet someone who actually seemed to appreciate me, you know? Not like those other college guys who were just looking for hookups or playing games. Gail was different. He was genuine, loyal, the kind of guy who would actually listen when I talked about my dreams and ambitions. What really sealed the deal for me was when I found out he didn't even go to his senior prom because he wanted to stay faithful to me. Can you believe that? We'd only been dating a few months, and he was already that devoted. I mean, it was actually kind of sweet, even if it was maybe a little over the top, but it showed me what kind of person he was. Someone who took commitments seriously, someone who wouldn't just abandon me the moment things got difficult or complicated. We had this amazing relationship all through the rest of college. I graduated a year before him and got a job in the city. And when it was time for his final year, he actually moved in with me. It felt so natural, so right. We were like this perfect team, you know? I was the practical one handling the real-world stuff, and he was still finishing up his degree. We'd talk for hours about our future plans, about grad school, about all the amazing things we were going to do together. That's when we started discussing graduate programs, and unfortunately, we ended up getting accepted to schools in different cities. It wasn't ideal, obviously, but we both knew it was temporary. 2, maybe 3 years at most, and then we'd be back together, ready to start our real adult lives. I was actually kind of excited about the independence, if I'm being honest. Don't get me wrong, I loved Gail, but there was something appealing about having my own space, my own life, without having to coordinate everything with someone else. The long-distance thing started out okay. We'd talk every night, text throughout the day, visit when we could afford it. But grad school is intense, and I was making new friends, getting involved in my program, really throwing myself into this new chapter of my life. Gail was doing the same thing on his end, of course, but somehow I felt like I was adapting better, embracing the change more fully. That's when I started noticing other people. Not in a serious way, just noticing. There were guys in my program who were smart, interesting, who shared my academic interests in ways that Gail, sweet as he was, never really could. And they noticed me too. I'd catch them looking at me during seminars, find excuses to chat after class, get invited to study groups and parties, and all these social events that were part of the grad school experience. The loneliness started creeping in around month 6. Gail and I were both so busy with our programs, and the phone calls started feeling more like obligations than genuine connection. He'd tell me about his day, I'd tell him about mine, and it all felt so routine. Meanwhile, I was surrounded by all these vibrant intellectual people who were living the same experience I was, who understood the pressures and excitement of graduate work in ways that Gail, stuck in his own program hundreds of miles away, just couldn't. I remember the first time something happened. There was this guy in my cohort, really brilliant, who'd been flirting with me for weeks. We ended up at the same party, had a few drinks, and things just progressed. Afterward, I felt terrible, obviously. But then I started thinking about it more rationally. Gail and I weren't engaged. We'd never even talked about marriage, not seriously. We were both young, in this incredible growth period of our lives, and expecting someone to just sit around being celibate and isolated for 2 whole years seemed kind of unreasonable when you really thought about it. Besides, it's not like I was looking for a relationship with this guy. It was just physical, just a release of tension and loneliness that had been building up for months. What Gail didn't know wouldn't hurt him, and it's not like it changed how I felt about our future together. If anything, getting that need met made me a better girlfriend when we did talk, more patient and understanding instead of resentful and frustrated. The thing is, once you cross that line once, it becomes easier to rationalize crossing it again. There was another guy a few months later, someone I met at a conference who was charming and attentive and made me feel appreciated in ways I'd forgotten I could feel. Then, there was a friends with benefits situation with someone in my research group that lasted for several months. Nothing serious, nothing that threatened my real relationship with Gail, just companionship. Physical and emotional needs being met during a really challenging time in my life. Look, I'm not proud of it, but cheating is pretty common in long-distance relationships. Everyone knows that. The statistics are actually pretty depressing if you look them up. And, honestly, maybe Gail was doing the same thing on his end, and just never told me. It's not like we were checking up on each other constantly or anything. We were both adults living separate lives, and sometimes adult needs take precedence over idealistic romantic notions. Over the course of those 2 years, there were probably 8 or 10 different guys total. Some were one-time things, some were more ongoing arrangements. I was always careful, always discreet, and I never let it interfere with my academic work or my relationship with Gail. When we talked on the phone, I was the same loving, supportive girlfriend I'd always been. When we visited each other, which wasn't often given our schedules and finances, everything was perfectly normal between us. By the time we were both finishing our programs, I was actually really excited to move back in together and start the next phase of our relationship. Those 2 years had been good for me. I'd grown as a person, figured out who I was independently, had experiences that made me more confident and self-assured, and I'd gotten all that restlessness and curiosity out of my system. I was ready to commit to Gail fully, to build the life we'd always talked about. When we reunited after grad school, it was like no time had passed at all. We fell right back into our old rhythm, found a place together, started building our adult life. Gail was just as sweet and devoted as ever, and I found myself really appreciating that stability after 2 years of uncertainty and casual arrangements. He proposed about 6 months after we moved back in together, and I said yes without hesitation. This was what I wanted. This solid, reliable love with someone who would never hurt me or leave me or make me question where I stood. Our wedding was beautiful, exactly what I'd always dreamed of. Gail was so happy, so grateful, telling everyone who would listen how lucky he felt to be marrying me. And I did feel lucky too. I'd had my experiences, learned about myself and what I wanted, and now I was choosing Gail with full knowledge of what else was out there. In a way, those 2 years had made me more certain about our relationship, not less. We settled into married life easily. Gail got a good job, I got a good job. We bought a house in a nice neighborhood with good schools because we both wanted kids eventually. When Parker was born 2 years later, I felt like our family was finally complete. Well, almost complete. Julia came along 3 years after that, and then we really were living the dream. 2 beautiful, smart kids, a comfortable home, stable careers, and a husband who still looked at me like I hung the moon after all those years together. I was a good mother, a good wife. I threw myself into family life with the same dedication I'd brought to everything else. PTA meetings, soccer practices, family vacations, holiday traditions. I created this warm, loving environment for my children that I was genuinely proud of. Gail was a wonderful father, patient and involved, and we made a great team when it came to parenting decisions and managing the household. 18 years of marriage went by in what felt like a blur. The kids grew up, became these interesting, independent people with their own personalities and opinions. Parker was 15 and starting to think about colleges. Julia was 12 and just hitting that preteen phase where everything was either amazing or terrible with no middle ground. We had our routines, our traditions, our comfortable life that felt solid and permanent. That's why I was so reluctant when Gail started talking about attending our grad school alumni reunion. It had been 20 years since we graduated, and honestly, I just didn't see the point. We had our life here, our responsibilities, and I wasn't particularly interested in reliving old memories or catching up with people I hadn't thought about in decades. But Gail was excited about it, kept talking about how fun it would be to see everyone again, to show off our successful marriage and beautiful family. I tried to get out of it with various excuses. The kids had things going on, work was busy, it would be expensive to travel. But Gail was persistent in that gentle way of his, and eventually I ran out of reasonable objections. Fine, I thought. We'd go, make polite conversation for a few hours, and then come home to our normal life. What was the worst that could happen? The reunion was exactly as boring and awkward as I'd expected. A bunch of middle-aged people trying to impress each other with their career achievements and family updates, everyone looking older and more tired than they wanted to admit. I was actually handling it pretty well, making small talk and playing the role of the happily married wife and mother, when Bella showed up. Bella had been in my program, someone I'd been friendly with but not particularly close to. She was one of those people who always knew everyone's business, who remembered every piece of gossip and drama from 20 years ago, like it had happened yesterday. She made a beeline for Gail and me as soon as she spotted us, gushing about how wonderful we looked, how amazing it was that we'd made it work after all these years. The conversation was going fine until she started reminiscing about grad school parties and social events. She was laughing about some drama involving people I barely remembered when she casually mentioned something about hookups during our grad school years. Not college, specifically grad school. And she looked right at me when she said it. I felt my stomach drop, but I tried to play it off casually. Maybe she was confused, mixing up time frames, thinking about someone else entirely. I laughed it off and tried to redirect the conversation, but I could see Gail's expression changing. He was looking at me with this puzzled, suspicious look that I hadn't seen in years. Didn't Bella clarify that she got confused? I said quickly, but Bella just looked at me blankly, clearly not understanding what I was trying to communicate. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I could feel Gail's eyes on me for the rest of the evening, could sense him processing what he'd heard. The drive home was tense and quiet. I kept trying to make normal conversation about the people we'd seen, the funny stories we'd heard, but Gail was clearly distracted. When we got home and the kids went to bed, I was hoping we could just go to sleep and pretend the whole awkward moment had never happened. But Gail had other plans. "We need to talk," he said, and I knew from his tone that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. He sat me down in our bedroom and asked me directly about what Bella had said. I tried to deflect, to act confused about what he was even referring to, but he wasn't buying it. "Did you cheat on me during grad school?" he asked, point blank, and I felt cornered in a way I hadn't experienced in 20 years. I could have kept denying it, but something in his expression told me he already knew the answer. So I went with a modified version of the truth, something that would satisfy his need for honesty without completely destroying our marriage. "It was just one time," I said, trying to sound appropriately remorseful. "It was a long time ago, and it didn't mean anything. I was lonely and made a stupid mistake that I've regretted ever since." But instead of the relief or forgiveness I was expecting, Gail just looked more hurt and angry. He started pacing around the room, running his hands through his hair, asking questions I didn't want to answer. How long had I been lying to him? How could I build our entire marriage on a foundation of deception? Did I have any idea what this meant to him? That's when I started getting defensive. I mean, honestly, his reaction seemed way over the top for something that had happened decades ago and had literally no impact on our current life. Maybe I was a jerk for being loyal, I thought, but at least I wasn't falling apart over ancient history that didn't matter to anyone. "We weren't even engaged," I pointed out, trying to make him see reason. "We didn't know where our relationship would lead. And I was dealing with a really difficult situation the best way I knew how. It's not like I was trying to hurt you. You never even knew about it until tonight." But Gail wasn't interested in my explanations or justifications. He was acting like I'd betrayed him yesterday instead of 20 years ago, like this one mistake somehow negated 2 decades of marriage and family and commitment. It was honestly pretty frustrating to watch him spiral over something so meaningless. The argument went on for hours, with him asking the same questions over and over and me trying to explain the context and circumstances that had led to my decision. But he wasn't listening, wasn't trying to understand my perspective at all. Finally, around 3 a.m, he announced that he needed space to think and that he was going to stay with Xavier for a while. I was shocked. I mean, I knew he was upset, but I didn't think he'd actually leave our home, leave our children, over something that had happened when we were basically still kids ourselves. But he packed a bag and left just like that, leaving me to figure out how to explain his absence to Parker and Julia. The next few weeks were incredibly difficult. The kids kept asking where their father was and when he was coming home, and I had to come up with explanations that wouldn't completely destroy their image of their family. I told them that Gail and I were having some problems and needed some time apart to work things out, which was true as far as it went. I kept expecting him to come to his senses and come home. This was his family, his life, his children who needed him. But days turned into weeks, and he was still staying with Xavier, still refusing to have any real conversation about working through this like adults. He'd call to talk to the kids, but he was cold and distant with me, like I was some stranger who had hurt him instead of his wife of 18 years who had made one mistake when she was young and stupid. I tried reaching out to him, tried explaining the situation more fully, but he wasn't interested in hearing my side of things. He was so focused on his own hurt feelings that he couldn't see the bigger picture. That we had built something beautiful together. That we had 2 children who needed both their parents. That throwing away 20 years over something so trivial was completely insane. After about 6 weeks of this nonsense, Gail finally came home. I thought he'd finally come to his senses, realize that our marriage was worth more than his wounded pride. But instead, he came home with divorce papers and a lawyer's business card. I couldn't believe it. I literally could not believe that he was serious about ending our marriage over this. You're really going to throw away our entire life together over something that happened 20 years ago? I asked him, but he just looked at me with this cold, determined expression I'd never seen before. The kids were devastated, obviously. They couldn't understand why their father was suddenly talking about divorce, why their stable, happy family was falling apart. I tried to explain it to them as gently as possible, but how do you tell your children that their father is destroying their family because he can't get over something that happened before they were even born? Gail insisted that we try couples therapy before finalizing anything, which I agreed to, mainly because I thought a neutral third party would help him see how unreasonable he was being. But the therapy sessions were just more of the same. Him acting wounded and betrayed, me trying to explain the context and circumstances that had led to my decisions. The therapist kept pushing for complete honesty, which I found pretty rich, considering that complete honesty was what had gotten us into this mess in the first place. But eventually, under pressure from both of them, I admitted that it hadn't been just one time. There had been several different guys over the course of those 2 years, maybe 8 or 10 total. Gail's reaction to this news was even more dramatic than his reaction to the original revelation. He actually stood up and walked out of the session, leaving me sitting there with the therapist, trying to explain that the specific number didn't really matter. The principle was the same whether it was 1 or 10. How does it matter? You're divorcing me anyways, is whether it's 1 or 10. I asked when he finally came back. But apparently, that was the wrong thing to say, because he just got even more upset. The therapy sessions became a complete waste of time after that. Gail was completely closed off to any real communication or problem solving, and I was getting tired of being treated like some kind of monster for having normal human needs during a difficult period of my life. We stopped going after about a month, and the divorce proceedings moved forward. The worst part was watching how this affected the children. Parker, especially, became really angry and resentful, and unfortunately, he was directing a lot of that anger at me. I tried to explain to him that sometimes adult relationships are complicated, that his father and I had both made mistakes over the years, but he wasn't interested in hearing a balanced perspective. "You're the one who broke this family, not Dad," he told me one day, which was incredibly hurtful and unfair. I was the one who had stayed and tried to work things out. I was the one who wanted to keep our family together. But somehow I was being painted as the villain in my own home. Julia was a little more understanding, but even she started questioning things she'd never questioned before. "If she could lie to you for 20 years, how do we know she hasn't lied to us too?" she asked Gail one day, not realizing I could hear her. That was probably the most painful moment of the entire process, realizing that my own children were starting to see me as untrustworthy. When it came time to decide custody arrangements, both kids said they wanted to live with their father. I was devastated, but I tried to be understanding. They were going through a difficult time, and Gail had been working hard to position himself as the innocent victim in all of this. I figured that once the initial shock wore off, they'd want to spend more time with me. The financial negotiations were another nightmare entirely. I had contributed just as much to our household over the years, had sacrificed just as much for our family, but Gail was acting like I didn't deserve anything, because of mistakes I'd made decades ago. I asked for the house to be valued at what we'd originally paid for it, rather than current market value, which seemed fair considering the circumstances, but he refused. I asked for some temporary alimony while I got back on my feet as a single person, but he refused that too. His lawyer kept talking about consequences for choices, like I was some kind of criminal instead of someone who had made some poor decisions during a difficult time 20 years ago. It was incredibly frustrating to be treated like I was the only one who had ever done anything wrong in our marriage. Like Gail had been this perfect husband who never made any mistakes or hurt my feelings or took me for granted. Eventually, we worked out an arrangement where he would pay me for my share of the house in installments, which wasn't ideal, but was better than nothing. The custody arrangement was supposed to be joint, but in practice, the kids spent most of their time with him, only coming to stay with me occasionally, and usually reluctantly. The whole process took about 6 months from start to finish, and by the end of it, I was exhausted and ready to move on with my life. I found a nice apartment closer to downtown, started dating again, tried to rebuild my social life outside of the married with children bubble I'd been living in for so long. It's been strange being single again after all these years, but also kind of liberating. I don't have to coordinate my schedule with anyone else or worry about someone else's feelings about my choices. I can go out when I want, see who I want, live my life on my own terms, without having to justify myself to someone who's determined to hold grudges about ancient history. The kids are slowly starting to come around, I think. Julia has been spending more time with me lately, and even Parker seems less hostile than he was initially. I think they're starting to realize that their father isn't quite the saint they thought he was, that relationships are complicated, and that people make mistakes without being fundamentally bad people. Gail has started dating too, apparently, though he's being very discreet about it around the children. Part of me wonders if his new girlfriend knows the whole story, or if he's presenting himself as this tragic figure whose evil ex-wife destroyed their perfect marriage through her terrible betrayal. Knowing Gail, probably the latter. Looking back on everything, I do wish things had worked out differently. I wish Gail had been mature enough to work through this like an adult, instead of blowing up our entire life over something that happened so long ago. I wish our children hadn't had to go through the trauma of their parents' divorce. I wish I had been smarter about keeping the past in the past where it belonged. But I don't regret the choices I made during grad school. I was young, I was lonely, I was trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted from life. The experiences I had during those 2 years helped shape me into the person I became, and I think I was actually a better wife and mother because I had gotten that restlessness out of my system before settling down. What I regret is trusting someone with information they couldn't handle maturely. I regret believing that Gail was secure enough in our relationship to understand that what happened before we were married didn't diminish what we built together afterward. I regret not realizing how fragile his ego really was underneath all that loyal, devoted husband act. If I had to do it over again, I would have taken those secrets to my grave. Some things are better left unsaid. And some people can't handle the complexity of real adult relationships. Gail wanted to live in a fairy tale where we were each other's first and only everything. And maybe I should have let him keep believing that instead of expecting him to deal with reality like a grown-up. Now we're both starting over in our 40s. Our children are dealing with the aftermath of a broken home. And for what? because he couldn't accept that I had a life and needs and experiences before our marriage that didn't revolve around him, because he couldn't understand that love isn't diminished by other people exist. I'm doing fine now. Better than fine, actually. I'm dating someone new, someone more mature and sophisticated who understands that people have histories and that those histories don't define everything about who they are today. Someone who appreciates me for who I am now instead of judging me for choices I made when I was barely an adult. Maybe this is all for the best. Maybe Gail and I had just grown too far apart over the years, become too different in our values and perspectives to make it work long-term anyway. Maybe those 2 years in grad school weren't the real problem. Maybe the real problem was that we were never as compatible as we thought we were. And it just took this crisis to make that clear. All I know is that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for being human, for having needs and desires and making imperfect choices during imperfect circumstances. I'm not going to let someone else's inability to handle complexity define my worth as a person or my right to happiness and companionship. Life is messy and complicated, and people who can't accept that are probably better off with someone else anyway.